Hi, I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I am here with another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads, which is the series I've been doing just about some of the books that I've read recently and sort of talking about what I liked about them, sometimes what I didn't like so much about them, and basically giving a sort of overview and a recommendation. Generally, I like to cover the books that I liked enough to recommend, I guess is part of it. But anyway, today I have two books, and this is a little different than I've covered two books in at least one of the other ones, and I've covered a whole set of books by one author one time, but this time it is two books by two different authors that are essentially broadly connected by their subject matter. In that, so the first book is Shaman by Kim Stanley Robinson, and the second book is Prehistory: The Making of the Human Mind by Colin Renfrew, both of which deal with prehistoric humanity. Shaman is a fiction book that covers a specific cast of characters living out a total time period of, I think, a couple of years, all told, within the lives of these characters, obviously with different levels of detail at different periods. Prehistory covers both a lot of information about the prehistoric world as we understand it, and prehistoric humanity as we understand it, but also a fair bit of more recent history of the discipline of sort of prehistory as a broad concept of archaeology and prehistoric anthropology as they have developed from their earliest instances. So you get sort of both the what we know today and a little bit of a sort of broad overview of how we came to know these things, and how we came to the discipline that exists today, and a discipline that engages with the issues that it engages with today, as opposed to earlier forms of the study of prehistoric anthropology and archaeology. So I'm going to start by talking about Shaman, which I liked a lot. I have not read the sort of biggest set of Kim Stanley Robinson books. He has a Mars series, Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars. I always forget whether, I assume that Green Mars is the last one, but maybe it's Blue Mars. I don't remember for certain. That have a reputation as being very, very intense, hard science fiction that was a real feat of scientific understanding, at least as of the time that they were written, but that are also very difficult to get into for people who are more interested in things like story and characters, and all of the things that lots of people read novels for entertainment for. So I haven't read those books. I have read Ice Hinge by Kim Stanley Robinson, which I liked a lot also, and fits into the kind of broad chronology of the Mars trilogy, but presents a essentially a single thread running through that story in a really interesting way, I thought. So I am not an expert. Basically, all of this to say, I'm not an expert on his books, but I have read at least one of them and enjoyed it. Shaman is a lot of fun. I enjoyed this book a lot. There are some elements that I think are likely to push some readers away. In particular, one of the things about this story is that a lot of it is really meant to occupy the kind of imagined mental experience or cultural experience of the characters. And we have our protagonist is Loon, who is a young man who is training to be a shaman for his particular clan. His mentor is Thorn, who is the current shaman, who is also sort of his adopted father in some ways, and there's Heather the healer, who is sort of like Loon's adopted mother. There's a number of other characters, Elga and Click, and all of these different kind of cast of characters who are all sort of involved in this life. And there's a lot of elements that are really interesting. One of the things that I really liked about this book so much is that it really gets into one of the points that I have made on here a number of times, that people who lived in other periods of history or prehistory often did not have access to a lot of the same knowledge that we do, but they definitely weren't stupid by any means, and oftentimes had a really sophisticated understanding of the world that they interacted with, while being shaped by expectations that we know are not totally true, or cultural myths, all of these different things that are not how we think about the world, but their kind of basic perceptive ability is often really impressive. And that holds true, I think, for reading texts that were written very long ago, as well as something a story that is written in modernity, but is about trying to understand what life was like for people living much earlier. At the same time, the thing that I think is likely to push people away from this book the most is the particular flavor of culture displayed. Especially, there's a lot of sexual content, a lot of the metaphors used, or the descriptions, all of these different things that I think basically of slang words to refer to genitalia or the act itself, or any number of other things. A couple of places where there are explicit, I guess you'd say, acts on screen, but also just a lot of kind of discussion of that concept, that's a core part of how these characters see the world and understand the world, is through the lens of human sexuality. And I did not find it so difficult or so off-putting that I didn't enjoy it, but I suspect that someone coming into it could very easily find themselves not really enjoying this book, just because of how much there is of that. Um, the other thing that I think will likely put people off is just how much a lot of the story is about inhabiting the world, and there's a lot of detail about how these characters inhabit the world, their understanding of the natural world, their what we think of as fairly simplistic technologies, but technologies that are really definitive for surviving in this type of hostile environment without a lot of the advantages that we enjoy today, or advantages that even humans living in more historical periods have enjoyed. And so, if you are not into this type of discussion of kind of what daily life is meant to be like for these characters, that will probably put it off. I think some of the reviews that I've encountered for this book really overemphasize how much of that there is in this story, because there is really a story that takes place. It's very much a coming of age story about Loon, who the first, I don't know, 10 or 15% of the book, I read it on Kindle and I don't remember exactly the percent, but the first chunk of the book is his initiation ceremony into adulthood. He is tasked with basically living for 2 weeks out in the wilderness, totally by himself, without being able to take anything with him. That he's not allowed to bring, like his fire making kit or anything. He's got basically his loincloth, and he has to figure out how to survive and thrive out in the wilderness by himself, to prove that he is, a fully capable member of the clan. And that's how the book starts. And it's a really great, I think, introduction to the story, because it very naturally allows the story to possess a very intense opening, because there's a lot of danger in the world that Loon is working to try to overcome, and he is, definitely not at the top of the food chain in this prehistoric world. But also we get this exciting stuff that kind of gets us attached to this character, and then once he returns to, I guess you might say, civilization as he understands her, returns to the community, we get the expansion of the story into understanding kind of how this whole community functions, and all these minor characters that have a role to play in the day-to-day life, but that we kind of didn't get distracted from in those opening sections that are all about Loon surviving on his own. So I thought that was a really a very classic way to handle that kind of story structure, in allowing our protagonist to become kind of a character that the reader is interested in, and then expanding into the world further. And so what I will say about the criticism of lack of story is that I don't think that is totally true. I think there is a lot of story that happens in this book, and I think there is a lot of it that is kind of subtly handled in ways that allow for the sort of most overt, or the most obvious thing that's going on is a lot of the what is daily life like material that so much of the book is concerned with, but that there is story happening even in all of those parts. There are important things going on while we are also sort of immersed in understanding what life is like for all these characters. And there's a really interesting, I was talking with my family about part of why I like this book, and that one of the things that I thought was so cool is that it seems like a lot of, obviously, various sci-fi and fantasy stories have a lot of different flavors, but that a lot of kind of hard science fiction, as being stories that are about people's engagement with the world that works as we understand it, but that has some major differences of technology and of the nature of things going on, that's also very much what's going on here, is the engagement of these characters, and of Loon in particular, but also our other characters who show up a number of different times, and do some pretty important stuff for the story, also engaging with the reality of their world, that again is a world where, the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, the laws of biology, all of these scientific things that we understand in one way are present in the world, in the sense that things happen the way we would expect them to, but they don't understand them the way that we do, and their engagement with the material world is shaped by the technology that they have access to. And the end result of that, I think, is a book that to me does a really good job of sort of straddling the in between of being a story that is almost like a nonfiction catalog of how people would live in this environment, and one that is very much a story about these characters that we care about and are interested in their struggles and want to see them succeed, and are kind of paying attention to the overarching narrative, especially the kind of coming of age element. And there's some really poignant parts of the story, especially near the end. One of the elements that has really stuck with me, one of the characters who in the story is dying, laments the loss of knowledge over the course of the generations, and is making a point about the way that this totally oral transmission structure of data, they don't have really, they don't have any way to write things down. They make marks on sticks or bones to count the days, like between full moons, and so they have a pretty sophisticated understanding of, like I said, a lot of the things of the world that they interact with, but they don't have a particularly good way of passing along knowledge except by the most kind of basic apprenticeship systems, and is making, and this character as he is dying is making the point about just how much has been lost over these successive generations of things that were not able to be passed down from one individual to another in that way, how much knowledge has been lost, and how much has had to be rediscovered because there is no record of it that has lasted. And that, I think, is a really, it's a really fascinating kind of metatextual juxtaposition to be reading a book that is text on a page or text on an e-reader screen or however else you're reading it, but is fundamentally the technological development that this character is not necessarily aware of, in the sense that he's like, oh, what we need to do is invent a system where we can write down symbols for the sounds that we speak so that we can speak, over the course of centuries through this. But it really is kind of the solution to the problem that these characters are identifying of not being able to pass along knowledge and information except in a face-to-face context. And so that, I think, makes for a really clever and interesting sequence in the story that is also very poignant, because this is a person who would be interested in the written word, who has no ability to engage with it because of their prehistoric circumstances, who exists within a text. And so I thought that was really fun and interesting, and part of why the book, I think, has stuck with me. And that sort of leads us into Prehistory by Colin Renfrew, which I liked a lot. I thought it was a lot of fun to read. It is nonfiction about the human prehistory, and it covers prehistory, the making of the human mind, sort of in some ways is a broad overview of our understanding of human prehistory, and also, like a lot of broad overviews, secretly or not so secretly. I guess it's secret in the sense that it doesn't happen until, like 110 or 120 pages into a 240 page book, has a really specific and sophisticated argument about that field that is in play, that is kind of hidden away until later on. The first section of the book really covers, I think I mentioned, the history of modern understanding of prehistory, starting basically with the basic realization that human prehistory is something that exists, that we are not just limited to the material that the literate civilizations have left behind about the world, that archaeology is not just a collector's hobby, but a discipline, and alongside a lot of different scientific developments, in particular Charles Darwin and the understanding of evolution through natural selection, the awareness of the sheer antiquity of humanity as a species, and that becomes a really a vitalizing force within the understanding of prehistory. And for a long time, there are very kind of different themes going on in the study of prehistory, partly influenced by technological advances in the modern world also. And one of the big developments in the story of our understanding of prehistory is the development of radiocarbon dating, and being able to put a much more specific time on certain artifacts using the principles of archaeological stratigraphy dating combined with the technology of radiocarbon dating to develop a much more concrete understanding of when these things actually happened, and supplementing the pre-existing knowledge of the earlier century or so of prehistoric archaeological research that mostly was sometimes able to create a sort of a path of linear development, an understanding of like which artifacts come from which place and which are earlier and which are later, all of that sort of stuff, but didn't necessarily have any concrete information about exactly how much earlier or anything like that. And so there's a really interesting theme running through this of the sort of broad modern technological and scientific developments that come to alter our own modern understanding of prehistory. And the one after radiocarbon dating is genome sequencing. And so there's a long section that covers basically the advances of what at the time, so the book was originally published in 2007, so there's a number of things that have been done since then, but at the time the really cutting edge understanding of the history of humanity through the use of DNA research and genome sequencing and all of that sort of stuff that is really fascinating and ties in to what is sort of the core argument of the book that I mentioned comes along a lot later, which is basically an argument about trying to use our archaeological methods and the material that has been gathered to do something that is in many ways much more difficult and more subtle than a kind of basic understanding of the fact that these things exist in the ground and they were used by people and created, and what it basically understanding what does that mean. And Colin Renfrew calls this cognitive archaeology, attempting to understand not just the daily life of people living in the circumstances that left behind these relics for us today, but understanding what their lives were like and what their thoughts were like and how they understood the world. And a lot of this becomes an argument that is basically about human engagement with the material world and the way that concepts are developed. One of the core discussions, he talks a lot about a set of weights that were found, I think, in modern day Pakistan. I don't remember exactly, but basically it's a set of weights carved out of rock, where each weight is twice the weight previously. So you have the one smallest unit and then another block that is two of the smaller one, and then a larger block that is four of the smallest, two of the next smallest, and so on. Essentially a basically the numerical structure of binary being presented as the one and the zero being the existence of a weight or not. And Colin Renfrew really gets into this idea of trying to understand what that means, the awareness of the physical world that comes out of lifting objects and understanding that because of gravity they have a weight in hand that is a reality of the material world, but also that through this really kind of conceptually sophisticated understanding of that reality through creating a tool, these weights and presumably some type of a scale to measure different weights against each other, that you could create essentially a conceptual framework of the world that is how much do things weigh in relation to each other and in relation to an abstract weight system. And Renfrew is making a point that this is, despite being something that we are today very familiar with, right? We can talk about like, how much does a person weigh? How much does a thing weigh? How much does a box being shipped through the postal service weigh? All of these things, that this is not something that humans are born understanding, despite the prevalence of this type of measurement in the modern world. And it is easy to forget that this is something that was developed and something that took a real cognitive leap to conceptualize the world in this way. And the sort of argument at the core of this book, Prehistory, The Making of the Human Mind, is that this is the sort of cutting edge of archaeology or prehistoric archaeology and prehistoric anthropology on the theoretical side. That really this is at the core, as he sees it, of what the discipline has kind of come to engage with most fundamentally, in the sort of, I guess you might say that the most important, like I said, theoretical side of the discipline, as in some ways distinct from the applied technology side of things like this sequencing the human genome, or of using the radiocarbon, the half-life of various carbon isotopes to understand history. That this is kind of what all of that material technology is used for in the most fundamental way, and is the sort of, I guess you might say, the most important element that could be got from all of that, which is also itself kind of an interesting argument about engagement with the material world, because all of the things, all of the technologies that have been talked about in the earlier section of the book are themselves theoretical realizations on some level, but they are also about engagement with the material world. They are also attempts to use technology, in this case, modern and very sophisticated technology, in order to engage with the reality of the natural world, or the less than natural world, the artificial world, in a fundamental way to further our understanding. And so there's a really interesting way in which this argument comes to apply to itself, in some sense, that we can see not only are the weights in this very, very ancient, I think, Harappan civilization town, not only are the weights one version of this, but also the entire process of radiocarbon dating in order to establish concrete understanding of the chronology of prehistory is also an expression of this type of discipline in some ways. And that, I think, is again part of why this is so interesting, not just as an overview of the history of prehistory as a discipline, not just as a discussion of the various finds or research going on in prehistoric anthropology and prehistoric archaeology, but really as something that comes to further our theoretical understanding of ourselves, both the version of ourselves that lived, 30,000 years ago, and the version of ourselves that is currently around. And so that, I think, is part of why to pick this book up and check it out. Unfortunately, I think this one is a little hard to find. I I bought a physical copy of it years ago and had only recently gotten around to reading it, unfortunately. Although fortunately that I eventually got around to reading it. I think it may be out of print. It's a modern library version is the version I have. So anyway, Kim Stanley Robinson, Shaman, Colin Renfrew's Prehistory, both really good, really interesting books that are worth checking out if you are interested in human prehistory from two different perspectives. So, that is going to be it for today for me. I seem to keep reading books somehow, not quite sure how that happens, but if you move your eyes back and forth on the pages enough times, you end up taking in something. And so I will probably keep doing more of these Pellam's Wasteland reads. I'm also sort of working on doing some more RPG stuff. We'll see what happens with that. But aside from all of that, I hope you check out these books if they sounded interesting to you. I would say that they're totally worth checking out if they did sound interesting to you. And, if you have read either of these, or if you have thoughts about the author's other work, or anything that you think I should read that is related to this, whatever else, leave a comment down below, all of that sort of stuff. I have not been very disciplined about responding to comments, but I'm trying to get back to that. Hopefully in the at some point I'll be better than that. I hope you can't hear. There's a siren going on outside my window, and I'm hoping that you guys can't hear that. But if you can, I apologize. Otherwise, I think that is going to be it for me for today. I have been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Happy reading, everybody.